All right, hi everyone. Congratulations. This is lecture video 8, which means that at this point you've made it about halfway through the class. So in this video, we're going to wrap up the material for Module 2 by finishing up our discussion of standardized testing. So when you're thinking about wrapping up Module 2, you need to be considering Exam 2. Remember that I will be posting a review video and a practice exam to help you prepare. But as always, if you have questions, please let me know. So if you need anything, feel free to email me. Let's go ahead and get started. All right, so as I said, we're going to be finishing up the information on standardized testing today. When we're talking about standardized testing, if we're going to give a test, then we need to make sure that it's a high quality test. At the very least, a poor quality test is something that's a waste of time and money and energy. However, at the most, we could potentially make the wrong decision about a program or about a student or about a school district if our standardized test provides us with misleading information. So there are a few things to keep in mind when we're evaluating standardized tests. Part of it has to do with the normative group that was used when the test was designed. So let me explain a little bit about what I mean here. And I may have mentioned this in an earlier video, but when you have a new test that you're designing, you come up with the questions, you put a lot of thought and effort into that process, but then once you do that, you get a lot of people to take your test. And those individuals are your normative group. Now, it's very important that you have a good representative normative group. So if, for example, your standardized test is intended for 10th grade students, then you need to get a variety of different types of 10th grade students. So obviously you want to get male students and female students. You want to get students of different ethnicities. You want to get students from different parts of the country. Students from different socioeconomic status, perhaps. Students with different ability levels. So you want to give it to maybe some students who are in gifted programs, some students who are in special education programs, students that are in a typical classroom. The reason you want to do this is because your results at the end of the day from your normative group, this will be your comparison. And then when everyone else takes the test, their results will be compared with the normative group. Now, let's say, for example, that you designed your test for 10th grade students and your normative group was only females. You only gave this test to female students to get your normative information about how well the average 10th grader should do on this test. Well, then it wouldn't really be right for a male student to take this test because they would not be compared with peers that were similar to them. Or what if we designed this test in Mississippi and we only gave the test to students in Mississippi, but then we intended to use it nationwide? So you need your normative group to represent all students who could possibly be taking the test. If you're thinking about 10th grade students, not all 10th grade students will be of the same age either. There may be some students that are younger, that have skipped some grades perhaps, or you have students that have been held back. So you want to include anyone who might possibly be taking the test. You want to include people like them in your normative group. So that's very important. In addition to that, though, we want to make sure that our tests are valid and reliable. Now, I think these terms have kind of generally showed up before, and we're going to discuss them generally here, and then we're also going to have some specific types of validity and types of reliability that we discuss in just a second. So, generally speaking, validity refers to accuracy. Does this test measure what it is purported to measure? If we are, for example, giving a test of mathematics skills, does it truly test mathematics skills and not test-taking skills or guessing skills or something like that? If we're having a test to measure intelligence, are we really truly measuring intelligence? Or is there something else that we're measuring we shouldn't be measuring? Or perhaps ask the question, is there some aspect of intelligence that we're not including on our test? So our test is valid if it is accurately measuring what it is supposed to be measuring. In addition to that, we also want our tests to be reliable. Now, reliability refers to consistency. If I give a test to a student on Monday, and then a week later I give them the test again, I would expect their score would be relatively consistent. Now, it might be that their score is a little bit higher the second time they take the test. Or it might be that it's impacted a little bit by their sleep or their mood or what kind of day they're having. But for the most part, their scores should be very similar to each other. So scores should be stable, dependable, and relatively free from error. Now, we say relatively free from error because it's impossible to completely remove error. We will always have at least a small amount of error, but we want to try to minimize that as much as possible. Now, let me ask you a couple of questions here. Is it possible for a measure to be reliable but not be valid? In other words, is it possible for your test to produce results that are consistent but are not measuring what they're supposed to be measuring? And the answer here is that yes, it absolutely is. Imagine with the scale example, I think I might have talked about this in the intelligence lecture. If I step on a scale and it says that I weigh 1,000 pounds, and I step off the scale, and I step back on the scale and it says I weigh 1,000 pounds, and I do this over and over again, it's reliable, but it's reliably wrong. This is an online class, so you guys can't see me, but I do not weigh 1,000 pounds. So it is possible that we could reliably be measuring something, and yet we're not accurately measuring something. So then let me ask you the reverse question. Is it possible for a measure to be valid but not reliable? In other words, is it possible to have results that are accurate but inconsistent? And the answer to that is yes, it is possible, but it's pretty rare. It depends on what you're measuring. So if you're measuring something like intelligence, intelligence is a fairly stable concept. So if your intelligence test score varied drastically from one month to the next, I would probably say there's something wrong with that test. However, what happens if your test is measuring something that is not consistent? Like, for example, a person's mood. I could have you come in, I could measure your mood, and you could be in a fantastic mood. Everything's going great, super happy. And a month later, you could have a very negative test result, and you're feeling depressed and you're struggling. And that could still be accurate, though. Accurate, valid, without being reliable, because some things like mood are greatly impacted by our environment and can shift from day to day. So I would say yes, it is possible, not likely, but possible, depending on what you're measuring. All right. So talking about a few specific types of validity, and there are other types of validity and reliability that we're not going to be touching on today, but talking about a few that are particularly related to the classroom. First of all, content validity, which is really what you think of when you think of validity. It talks about the test's ability to sample the content that is being measured. So if I'm interested in your reading ability, I want my test to measure only reading ability and not anything extra, but also I want my test to measure every important aspect of reading ability. So you might include fluency. Is the person able to read smoothly, quickly, or at an appropriate pace? You might include reading comprehension. Is the person actually understanding something after they've read it? You might include some reading skills that maybe have something to do with vocabulary, but there are several different components of reading, and for a test to be content valid, it would need to measure all the different components of reading without including any other components. And the way that you're going to increase this content validity is by talking to experts in the area. So if you're interested in reading, talk to the experts on reading and have them look over your test and make sure that you're measuring all the important components of reading. In addition, we might have concurrent validity. So this is the relationship between a test score and other available criteria. So let's say that we have produced a standardized test for reading. We could have concurrent validity if a student's performance on our reading test also was highly correlated with their performance on reading in the classroom. If we had a standardized test that says that a student is an excellent reader, and then in the classroom they're really struggling with reading, we might say, well, there must be something wrong with our test, because in the real world they're struggling but the test says they're fine, or vice versa. And maybe the test says they're struggling, but in the classroom they're doing just fine. That might be a signal that our test is not valid. So that would be concurrent validity, comparing your results on your measure to other things in the world that are measuring the same thing. And then finally, predictive validity, on a related note, is the relationship between a test score and future performance. So some standardized tests are intended to predict a person's future performance. So for example, when you take the ACT, the purpose of the ACT, as far as I can tell, aside from torturing college students, high school students, and causing insomnia, the purpose of the ACT is to make a prediction about how a high school student will go on to perform in college. And that's why things like scholarships, for example, in part are influenced by ACT scores. It's supposed to be predictive, so that a student who has a high ACT score tends to go on and do well in college. A student who has a lower ACT score tends to go on and perhaps struggle in college. Now, we certainly know that this is not always the case. We know that some students who have very high ACT scores lack the motivation or the self-control or the time management to be successful in college. We also know that some students who do poorly on the ACT have the motivation and the self-control and whatever it takes to be successful in college despite that. So the tests that we have are not perfectly predictive. And so why do we use them? Well, good question. Short answer, because we don't have anything better, because it's the best that we have. So if you guys want to make a whole lot of money, then be the next person to go out there and make the greatest predictive test to replace things like the ACT perhaps. But like, for example, the GRE is intended to measure a college student's capacity for graduate school. Of course, there's certainly a lot of other factors that determine whether a student is successful in graduate school or not, but it's intended to be predictive anyway. Not perfect, certainly could be improved upon, but at least that's the intention. When we talked about reliability, we referred to results that are consistent. There are a few different ways to think about reliability. Test-retest reliability is the extent to which a test yields the same or at least a similar score when given to a student on two different occasions. So if you take an intelligence test score and then later take an intelligence test, I should say. If you take an intelligence test and then later you take the same test again, your score should be fairly similar. It probably won't be exactly the same, but should be fairly similar. If you take a test in educational psychology and then were to take it again a few days later, your score should be fairly similar. This is test-retest reliability. Alternate form refers to two different forms of the same test given on two different occasions. So sometimes this happens when a teacher has a large classroom and maybe is concerned about cheating. So when I taught general psychology, for example, at Mississippi State, and I would have 100 students in the classroom, of course, I was walking around watching everyone take the test, but there was no way for me to have my eyes on everyone. So I had alternate forms of the test where some students were taking version A, some students were taking version B. Now, if you have two different forms of the test, then you could afterwards look at the scores on version A and the scores on version B, and they should be fairly consistent if they are equivalent. There's no reason why the scores on version B should be higher or lower than the scores on version A. They're two versions of the same test. Now, it could be possible that it works out that way, where students do better on one version than the other version, and there are a lot of little things that can cause that. I actually talked to a professor once who had done some research, and he was mentioning that the type of paper that you use and the way that you format your test were important. That students who, if you take a test on white paper where it's front and back, where you can see through the paper till you can see a little bit of the questions on the back, that actually reduced student scores. And he hypothesized that maybe the fact that you could see upcoming questions was just anxious, maybe made people feel some pressure. They weren't able to focus on the question they were on currently, perhaps. So keeping that in mind, you want to have all those things consistent from version A to version B of a test. And then split half reliability refers to dividing the test into two halves. So one way to do this might be the first half of the test versus the second half. So if there are 50 questions, compare the first 25 and the second set of 25. there shouldn't be a reason for students to do really well on the first part of the test and then do poorly on the second part. You could also do a comparison between even and odd questions here, and there's no reason why there should be a major difference between them as well. So if you see differences between tests on different forms or the same test on different days, then perhaps there's something wrong with your tests. They don't seem to be reliable. All right. What can you actually do in the classroom when it comes to preparing yourself and preparing your students, as well as communicating information about standardized testing to parents? Because I can assure you, parents will also have questions and they'll want to try to understand their students' performance on standardized tests. Well, we're going to talk about that. Before we touch on that, though, it is important to know the difference between an aptitude test and an achievement test. So basically, an aptitude test measures a person's potential for learning, whereas an achievement test measures something the student is supposed to have already learned. So aptitude tests predict a student's ability to learn a skill or accomplish a task with further education or training. So an example of an aptitude test would be an intelligence test. An intelligence test is not asking you specific questions, specific vocabulary, or solve these specific math problems, or who was the king of England during this particular time period. It's not something that you memorize, and therefore because of that, it's not really something you can prepare for. You can't really study and get a better grade on an intelligence test. Now, when students do take intelligence tests, we do give them some recommendations about ways to improve skills. For example, if a person does poorly in the working memory portion, then we might give them some games to play or some activities to do to help build up their memory. But that's not really studying, memorizing certain information, that kind of thing. It's more like just kind of shoring up a weakness. But an aptitude test measures your potential to learn something if a person were to teach you. On the other hand, achievement tests measure what the student has already learned or mastered. So, for example, you have exam 2 coming up in educational psychology. A test in a college class is an achievement test. I'm measuring what you have learned so far in the class. So there will be specific questions relative to the information that you've been taught. Now, classroom testing is not the only place where you'll see achievement testing. We also do achievement testing with clients that come to the clinic for an assessment. So if I, for example, have a client come in and they're maybe concerned about their performance in the classroom, do I have a learning disability? As I mentioned in a previous lecture, one of the ways we do that is by comparing a person's score on an intelligence test and an achievement test. So if a person has the aptitude, their intelligence score is average or above average perhaps, but their achievement is low, then that tells me that it's not an intelligence issue, but it could potentially be a learning issue, or it could be a relationship issue with a teacher. So sometimes certain teaching styles are more effective for certain students. So you may have a student who has the potential for learning, their IQ is average or above average, but then because of a bad fit in the classroom, or maybe because of bullying or any number of things in the classroom, the student may not be performing as well as he or she could in a different setting. So achievement refers to testing what you've actually specifically already been taught, whereas aptitude measures your potential to learn if you were to be taught something. So keeping that in mind, the state standards-based tests that you would be given in a public school are intended to be achievement testing. They're supposed to be measuring the information that you have learned in the classroom. Now, I do understand, having read many different semesters worth of students' activities about standardized testing, I do understand there are a variety of opinions and emotions related to standardized testing. Having said that, though, at least for the moment, they are in place, and so this is something we have to learn to work with. So when it comes to standards-based tests, there are some arguments for and against, and some of these you guys touched on in your activities. So possible advantages here, improved student performance. So this is the idea that we're holding students accountable for their learning. And so perhaps because they know they're going to have to take the test, then this might give some motivation to be engaged in the classroom. More teaching time, if perhaps we're going to be doing these assessments outside of the classroom or at other specified times, then maybe the assessment portion of teaching doesn't take up as much time and there's more time for actual classroom learning. Higher student expectations, so students know what's expected of them, and then hopefully this is a good thing. Hopefully these expectations are inspiring, not discouraging. Identification of poor performing schools and teachers. Obviously, if we have a major issue with state testing, if the scores are very low consistently, then this provides us with information about teachers that might need to be retrained, or about school systems that might need to try new programs, might need different books, different technology, different funding situation, whatever the case may be. In addition, I would also hope that we could do the opposite. I would hope that our state's standard-based test could also identify school systems that are doing well, and then we could learn from those school systems what they're doing that's working, as well as giving parents confidence in sending their children to those schools. And it talks about improved confidence in schools. I think the fact that we hold schools accountable is important, and I think that it makes us feel more comfortable sending children to a school that we have some consistent data that what they're doing there works. So these are some possible advantages, but of course there are plenty of criticisms. When it comes to how the standards-based tests impact the teacher, it talks about dumbing down the learning and teaching to the test. So this is something that I can completely understand. If you're a teacher and you know that your job is writing on the performance of your students on this particular test, and you know also that important decisions will be made for your students based on the results of this test, then you can understand why teachers would feel pressure to have to teach to the test then and only cover specifically the things that are going to be on the test and only use the test format in the classroom so that students have practice and students have time to prepare. But of course the problem with doing that is that these standards-based tests are usually multiple choice. They're usually not something that involves writing, not something that involves critical thinking, problem solving, hands-on projects. And so because of that, since we're basically saying that this is a particular type of learning that we value and we don't value the other types of learning, then a teacher may feel like they just don't have the time or the energy to put into other kinds of learning in the classroom, hands-on things, projects, the kinds of things that students will really remember. So, as a teacher, what are you going to do to help prepare your students to take this test, to help them understand their results? How is standardized testing going to impact you? Well, first of all, let's start off with some things we should try not to do. Now, bearing in mind, I do understand all of these. I completely understand why these things happen. But first of all, it talks about not teaching to the test. I just touched on this. I do understand. You feel a lot of pressure to have good performance in your classroom. When things like whether you get to keep your job and whether you get a bonus and the way that funding is allocated depends on the scores. I do understand that. But at the same time, it would be ideal if we could incorporate other types of learning as well, instead of just using a standardized test format in the classroom. Students do need practice taking the kinds of tests that they're going to be faced with, but I feel like there are certainly other methods of assessment that could be included as well. And yes, I am completely aware of the fact that I sound entirely hypocritical here, because our tests in this class are primarily multiple choice, true, false, and matching. Your final exam is essay, but I do have you do your activities hoping that you'll have some opportunities to express yourself, to practice your critical thinking, writing skills during the activities. The reason, honestly, why I don't do all essay tests is because I don't have time to do all essay tests. I usually teach several classes a semester, have many students, and don't have an opportunity to do that. Having said that, though, there are certainly advantages to using multiple types of assessment. Trying not to describe the test as a burden, which also goes along with conveying a negative attitude about the test. Many of you did convey a negative attitude about standardized tests in your activities, which is fine for you to convey that to me. It didn't harm me in the slightest. I was expecting it, actually. But when you're the teacher and your students are looking to you, especially maybe the students that haven't had a ton of experience with standardized tests yet. They're looking to you to help them understand what's about to happen to them and why. And so trying to have a positive attitude about it as much as possible can be helpful. Now, it says to try not to tell students that important decisions will be made solely on the results of a single test. I think the purpose here is to try to reduce the pressure that students feel before taking a test, because certainly that's not helpful. Having said that, I think the best way to accomplish this would be to not make important decisions based solely on the results of a single test, but also taking into account classroom performance, talking with other teachers, parents, with a student. Other things should be definitely considered besides making a big decision with just one test result. And using previous forms of the test to prepare students kind of goes back to teaching to the test and using that standardized test format too much. We want to make sure that we do have time for other types of learning in the classroom. All right. Now, here are some tips that you can give to students who are about to be taking standardized testing. And maybe you yourself have some anxiety about standardized testing. Maybe you're thinking about going to grad school and there's a GRE coming up in your future. A few things to keep in mind here. Read instructions and individual items carefully. It is incredibly tempting to just start skimming, because once a timer is going, and this is usually where the test anxiety comes in, having a timer going while you're trying to take the test. I feel like students could probably complete the test in less time, more accurately without the timer, but unfortunately the timer is often necessary for various and sundry reasons. But reading each instruction and each individual item carefully, because you can very easily miss an entire group of questions because you misunderstood the instructions. Keeping track of time. Now, this sounds counterintuitive. Oftentimes people say, just don't look at the clock, don't worry about the clock. But the problem is, if you do that, then you might get yourself kind of bogged down in some of the earlier questions and never even get a chance to guess on the later items and end up leaving them blank. So it's actually better to keep an eye on the time so that you don't leave anything blank. Skip the difficult items and return to them later. The reason for this is that at the end of the test, if you still have some questions you haven't answered, you're going to have to go through and quickly guess. We would rather have you go through and quickly guess on the ones that you were already struggling with. We don't want you to have to go through and quickly guess the ones that you could have answered correctly if you had time to get to them. So answering the questions you're most confident with first, then that allows you to use some wisdom in allocating your time for those difficult items. As always, make informed guesses rather than omitting items. Never leave anything blank. This doesn't happen so much when I use things like Canvas, but when I have given in-person multiple choice tests, I've had students leave questions blank. And I think, why would you leave a multiple choice question blank? Oh, I have students, when I do the essay final exams, I have students who leave questions blank. Don't do that. At the very least, make a guess. And with something like an essay test, you could at least get partial credit for that. So don't just leave items blank. Also, on multiple choice tests, eliminate as many items as possible. So even if you're not sure, maybe you can narrow them down to 2. And so you'd have a better chance of picking between 2 than picking between 4. So eliminate as many items as possible and double check. One thing if you're using a Scantron is to make sure that the number on the Scantron matches the number on the test. If you kind of get off on one question, then all of your answers could be off. So double checking, if at all possible, is great. So how are you going to report this to parents? As a teacher, one of the more difficult, I would imagine, aspects of communicating with parents would be talking to parents about test results and about classroom performance. Now, one thing I do want to say here, and I don't think this is on the slides anywhere, but it depends on what age you're teaching. If an individual is over the age of 18, or if an individual is emancipated or that kind of thing, then the rules may be different for what you're allowed to communicate to the parents. So you want to carefully check with the supervisors about policies about this. Now, if you're teaching 5th graders, obviously communicate to whatever the parents want to know. But for example, I teach college classes, and so there is a certain release that you have to give for me to be able to share results with your parents. I don't hear from parents too often teaching college classes, but every once in a while you will hear from a parent. And so I am legally required to not communicate grades and things to parents unless I have the express permission of the student to do so. So it does depend on the age range that you're teaching. So that's just something to keep in mind. But don't report the test results in isolation. Make sure the parents know that this is one test score, which provides some valuable information, but is not the entire picture. There are certainly other things to consider, classroom performance, that kind of thing. Try to use easy to understand language. So some parents will have different levels of understanding or experience with standardized testing. Even parents that are highly educated may be educated in a different field, and so they may not understand a lot of the terms that you use. So use easy to understand language. Tell the parents that the scores are approximate rather than absolute because it's true. So when I would do assessments in the clinic, I would say, okay, you've heard me say this a few times already. This is an approximate. This is the range of scores. We really believe your score is somewhere between these ranges, but we have to have the ranges because what kind of breakfast did you eat? How well did you sleep the night before? What kind of mood you're in? Those kinds of things impact your performance at least a little bit. So make sure parents are aware of that. Percentile scores may be just easiest to understand. So your child did better than 60% of other children of that age group or classmates, that kind of thing. Be ready to answer parents' questions. You may not be able to predict all of the questions that parents will have, but you may be able to predict some of them. So have an idea in mind of what you would like to say, what you would like to communicate to each individual set of parents, and then be prepared. But one other thing, if someone asks you a question and you don't know the answer, it's okay to say, that's a great question. Let me think on that. Let me look into that. Let me talk to my supervisor and get back to you. It is okay to not have the immediate answer as long as you then do the research, follow through, and provide the correct answer as soon as possible. And talk with, not to, the parents. This will depend on the parents. Some parents will come in totally prepared with a list of questions and they will want to engage in a conversation with you. Some parents will come in, they'll listen to what you have to say, and they'll get up and leave, and they won't really say anything at all. So as much as possible, trying to engage them in a conversation. Questions like, does this sound right to you? Is this what you were expecting? So tell me what this means to you. What are you hearing when I talk about this? What are your thoughts on this issue? It shows them that you respect their opinion, but it also lets you make sure that they truly are understanding you. So let's reflect a little bit. What standardized tests have you taken, and how have these tests affected your perceptions of competence? So we all have our own experiences with standardized testing, and that's good because when your students come to you and they are maybe going to be taking the test and they're worried about it, then you can understand that and you can help them. Or if they've already taken the test and maybe they're not sure about their results, you can understand that. You can talk through that with them. As a college professor, I do hear from students all the time that come and talk to me about the GRE. And I think at the very least I'm able to calm them down a little bit and help them see that everyone was anxious going into the GRE, but we typically survive it. When I was about to take the GRE, I can remember I did not sleep the night before. I just woke up at like 3 o'clock in the morning and started cramming information in my brain. And that, by the way, is the wrong thing to do. You want to get sleep, and cramming does not work for your brain. You should start studying early and space your studying out. But sometimes there's this knee-jerk reaction, like I just have to cram as much as I can into my brain before I take this test. And so it's such a relief when it's over. But because you've had experiences with standardized tests, you can relate to your students or to your children when they're taking standardized tests, or to friends or to other people. So reflect back on your own experience and try to find ways to use that to help other people have better experiences. Alright, so that is the end of the material for Exam 2. So as I said, I'm going to be posting the review video just like I did for Exam 1. There is also a practice exam that's going to be open at the same time the exam is open that you can take for extra credit. And feel free to let me know if you have any questions about the material. Focus on Exam 2. Let me know if you need anything, and I will talk to you guys when we start the material for Exam 3. So have a great day.